When I was 9, I started sleeping in our attic bedroom. It was a small, cozy space that my mom decorated with fairy lights and hand-me-down quilts. She called it my sanctuary. But really, it was just the place I went to avoid the tension that had been creeping into my parents' marriage. My dad didn't sleep upstairs anymore. He spent most nights on the couch in the living room, muttering about back pain or an early morning shift. I didn't really understand it then, but I could sense the unspoken distance between them. The attic had a single round window, one of those old, thick glass ones that distorted the view outside. It overlooked our overgrown backyard and the dark forest beyond it. At night, I would stare out, watching the way the moonlight cast eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and shift. Sometimes I'd convince myself I saw something, a shape moving, or a face in the darkness. Most nights I'd hide under the covers, heart pounding until I fell asleep. But occasionally I couldn't take it, and I'd creep down the stairs to the living room. My dad would always be awake, half sitting, half lying on the couch with a book in his hands. "What's wrong, kiddo?" he'd ask. I'd mumble something about the attic window, and he'd laugh softly, ruffling my hair. "It's just trees and shadows, Ava. Nothing that can hurt you." But even his calm words couldn't shake the feeling I had, that there was something out there. One particularly bad night, after I woke him up for the 3rd time, he grabbed an old quilt from the linen closet and climbed the attic stairs with me. "Here," he said, nailing the quilt over the window. "No more shadows, okay?" For a while that worked, but the comfort didn't last. My dad passed away a little over a year later. It was sudden, a heart attack that struck him as he sat on that same couch, reading the same kind of worn paperback he loved. I was at school when it happened, and I'll never forget the way my mom's face looked when she picked me up early. It didn't seem real at first. I kept expecting him to walk through the door, to tell me it was some kind of mistake. But the house felt so much emptier without him in it, and I avoided the living room completely. The couch, now just a piece of furniture, felt wrong somehow, like it was waiting for him to come back. Months passed, and slowly, I started to return to some kind of routine. I went back to the attic bedroom, back to staring at that window, now covered by the quilt my dad had hung. I'd run my fingers along its edges, thinking about how his hands had secured it there, how he'd done it to make me feel safe. It became a kind of ritual before bed. One night, though, the quilt fell. I woke up to the sound of it hitting the floor, and the faint chill of air seeping through the exposed glass. Groggy, I sat up, blinking in the dim light of the room. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw him. There was a figure in the yard. He wasn't standing still. He was moving, pacing back and forth near the edge of the forest. The warped glass distorted his shape, but I could see enough to recognize the broad shoulders, the way he moved with a familiar rhythm. My breath caught in my throat and I couldn't look away. "Dad," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible. The figure didn't stop or look toward me. He just kept pacing, like a guard on patrol. I don't know how long I watched him. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that, at some point, I lay back down, my eyelids heavy, and let sleep take over. I don't remember dreaming that night, just a deep, heavy sleep like I hadn't felt since before he died. When I woke up, the yard was empty. The light of the morning sun made everything feel ordinary again, like the night before had been a strange figment of my imagination. But I knew better. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. I didn't tell my mom. She was already stretched too thin, and I didn't want her worrying about me seeing ghosts in the yard. But after that night, I stopped fearing the window. I never put the quilt back up, and the shadows outside didn't scare me anymore. It wasn't just because I thought my dad was out there, though maybe that was part of it. It was because, for the first time in a long time, I felt safe, like he was still watching over us, making sure nothing could hurt me. I never saw him again, but every time I looked out that window at night, I felt him there. And somehow, that was enough. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. I've always prided myself on being an adventurer. For years, I'd thrown myself into wilderness treks, mountain climbs, and kayaking trips without hesitation. But if I've learned one thing, it's that some places are better left unexplored. 5 years ago, I joined a winter survival retreat in northern Alaska. The brochure promised an authentic Arctic experience: igloo building, ice fishing, and braving the stark beauty of the polar tundra. It felt like the ultimate test of my skills. I wasn't inexperienced. I'd been on countless excursions before, but the Arctic, this was different. Our guide was a rugged man named Carl, a veteran outdoorsman with a gravelly voice and a no-nonsense demeanor. There were 6 of us in the group, all eager, maybe a little naive, ready to embrace the challenge. We were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by a frozen wilderness that stretched endlessly under a sky of perpetual twilight. The sun barely skimmed the horizon during the day before sinking back into the shadows. The first few days were exhilarating and grueling. Carl taught us how to start a fire in sub-zero temperatures, identify animal tracks, and most importantly, build an igloo. Constructing one was a painstaking process, but there was something satisfying about carving snow into perfect blocks and locking them together like puzzle pieces. By the 3rd day, I felt ready for anything the Arctic could throw at me. I couldn't have been more wrong. That evening, Carl announced that we'd spend the night in the igloos we'd built. Each of us would have our own, arranged in a loose semicircle around the main campsite. The thought of sleeping alone in the frozen wilderness was both thrilling and unnerving. The vast emptiness around us was starting to feel oppressive. The endless white seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the occasional whisper of the wind. I crawled into my igloo, zipped up my sleeping bag, and let the cold silence settle over me. It was oddly peaceful. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic, just pure, undisturbed quiet. I drifted off quickly, cocooned in the stillness of the Arctic night. Sometime later, I woke up with a jolt. At first, I wasn't sure why. The igloo was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the snow walls. My breath hung in the air, visible even in the darkness. Then I heard it, a crunching sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps on snow. I told myself it was Carl, doing a perimeter check, or maybe one of the others stepping out for some air. But the steps were too slow, too deliberate. And they weren't fading away. They were circling my igloo, each pass drawing closer. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, pressing in on all sides. And then came the tapping. It was soft at first, like someone gently knocking on the igloo walls. Tap, tap, tap. Then it grew louder, more insistent. My first instinct was to call out, but fear gripped my throat, choking off my voice. My hands fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally clicked it on, the beam illuminated the small space around me. Snow walls, my gear, nothing else. The tapping stopped. I sat there, clutching the flashlight, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Exhaustion eventually pulled me under, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, it was morning. The pale light of dawn filtered through the igloo walls. I crawled out, eager to shake off the unease of the night. But something was wrong. The campsite was silent. Eerily so. The other igloos stood untouched, their entrances sealed as if no one had left them all night. I called out for Carl, then the others, but no one answered. I checked each igloo one by one. Inside, the sleeping bags were neatly zipped, the gear untouched. It was as if they had simply vanished. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, uneven, and led away from the campsite in a single line. The prints were unlike any I'd seen before. Too wide, too deep. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my gear and followed them. The trail wound through the tundra, cutting across fields of untouched snow. The monotony of white played tricks on my eyes. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. The footprints grew fainter, as though whatever had made them was barely touching the ground. Then I saw it. A massive igloo looming in the distance, far larger than any we'd built. Its entrance gaped like a black void, ringed by strange symbols carved into the snow. My gut screamed to turn back, but curiosity pulled me forward. Inside, my flashlight revealed a pile of belongings, jackets, backpacks, boots, all covered in frost. At the center of the pile was a handprint pressed into the snow. It was massive, its fingers long and spindly. A low, guttural sound echoed behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The wind howled, whipping snow into a blinding frenzy. Panicked, I stumbled out of the igloo, only to find the landscape around me had changed. The footprints were gone. The horizon was featureless, endless. I ran, shouting into the wind, my voice swallowed by the storm. Just as I was about to collapse, I saw a faint light in the distance. Relief surged through me, but when I reached it, my heart sank. It was the campsite, but wrong. The igloos were larger, their shapes distorted. My own igloo stood intact, its entrance open like a gaping maw. Exhausted, I crawled inside and collapsed. I woke to tapping. This time it was everywhere. The walls vibrated with the sound, growing louder, faster. I screamed, clawing at the entrance, breaking free into the blinding white. The last thing I remember is stumbling through the snow, the tapping following me, relentless. When I woke again, I was in a hospital. A rescue team had found me wandering the tundra, delirious and frostbitten. They told me I was the only one they'd found. The others were never recovered. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. But I know this. The Arctic is vast, silent, and empty. But it isn't lifeless. Something waits out there in the cold. And it's watching. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. The woods near my grandparents' cabin always had an inexplicable pull on me. They weren't particularly extraordinary, just dense evergreens stretching endlessly under a canopy of frost and snow. Yet they felt alive in a way I couldn't articulate, as if they were holding secrets just out of reach. As a child, I spent hours exploring them, building forts, tracking deer, and letting my imagination run wild. But after one winter when I was 19, I never went back. That year, I returned home from college for the holidays, eager to escape the stress of finals and spend time with my family. My grandparents had invited everyone to their cabin, a cozy, timeless retreat at the very edge of those woods. The place was like a step back in time, creaky floorboards, a roaring fireplace, and the faint smell of pine and cinnamon hanging in the air. The first few days passed peacefully. My cousins and I spent our mornings sledding and our evenings gathered around the fire, listening to my grandfather's stories while sipping cocoa. But on the third night, everything changed. It was late, probably close to midnight. The rest of the house had gone to bed, and I was reading by the warm glow of a bedside lamp. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and pressing against the old cabin walls. It was just background noise, comforting in a way, until I heard something else. Crunch, crunch. The sound was faint, distant, like footsteps on snow. I froze, straining to listen. At first I thought it might be one of my cousins sneaking out for a smoke, but these steps were heavy and deliberate, far too deliberate to be casual. They circled the cabin, slowly. I set my book down and crept to the window, heart pounding. Outside was nothing but black silhouettes of trees against the snow. The footsteps paused beneath my window, and for a long moment I held my breath. Then they continued, moving steadily around the house before fading into silence. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I bundled up and stepped outside to inspect the snow. Sure enough, there was a single set of tracks circling the cabin, large and human-like, but strange. The prints were spaced unnaturally far apart, as if whatever made them had an unnerving, loping gait. When I showed the tracks to my grandfather, his face tightened. He brushed it off with a vague explanation about a local hunter, but his voice lacked conviction. That night, the power went out. We huddled around the fireplace, the only source of light in the cabin. Shadows danced on the walls as the flames flickered. My cousins joked nervously about snow monsters, while my grandfather lit a few candles, though I caught the tension in his eyes. The cabin seemed to creak and groan louder than usual, the absence of wind leaving an oppressive stillness. And then, just as I was starting to doze off, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, heavier, and accompanied by a rhythmic tapping, knuckles rapping against the wooden walls. Tapping. My cousins and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, but no one moved. The sound circled the cabin, pausing occasionally before resuming its relentless pace. Finally, my grandfather and uncle grabbed flashlights and told us to stay put. We listened as they stepped outside, their muffled voices disappearing into the night. When they returned, they were pale and tight-lipped. My grandfather muttered something about not finding anything and urged us to go to bed, but my uncle's expression told a different story. He kept glancing toward the windows, his hands trembling as he hung up his coat. The next day, my cousins and I made the foolish decision to explore the woods. Maybe it was youthful bravado or a desire to shake off the unease of the night before. but we grabbed our jackets and trudged into the snow. At first it was fun. We laughed, threw snowballs, and joked about being brave adventurers. But as we ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer, and the air colder. It felt as though the forest was closing in on us. That's when we found it, a clearing littered with bones. They were scattered across the snow, some small and delicate, others large and unmistakably human. My stomach churned. The snow around them was pristine, untouched, as if the bones had been deliberately placed rather than left behind by scavengers. We didn't speak. We just turned and ran. The cold air burned our lungs as we raced back to the cabin, the bones etched into our minds like a warning. When we told my grandfather, he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he sighed and told us a story. Decades ago, he said, a group of loggers had vanished in those woods during a brutal winter. Their bodies were never found, but locals whispered about strange sounds, footsteps, tapping, even faint whispers in the night. The forest, he said, his voice heavy, has a way of keeping its secrets. That night, we barricaded the doors and windows with furniture, keeping the fire blazing. The footsteps returned, louder than ever, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. They circled relentlessly, the tapping growing into a deafening rhythm. At one point, the doorknob rattled, and I thought for sure whatever was out there would break in. But just before dawn, the sound stopped. At first light, my grandfather announced that we were leaving. We packed hurriedly, abandoning most of our belongings in our rush to escape. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. In the daylight, they seemed calm, almost inviting. But I knew better. Somewhere in those frostbitten trees, something was watching. Something that didn't belong in our world. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that winter. Maybe it was nothing more than shadows and fear. Or maybe it was something ancient. Something that had been waiting. If you're ever tempted to wander into the wilderness, remember this. Not every place is meant to be explored. And some secrets are better left buried beneath the snow.